everybody. My name is Max Riesing. I am from the University of Twente, and I will hold the talk with the title, Should Network Operators Hop on the Data Plane? So let me first introduce myself. I am 26 years old. I'm a German student studying in the Netherlands, and I finished my bachelor's in technical computer science at the University of Twente in last summer. And since then, I am in my master's also in computer science with a specialization in data science. And besides my study, I work as a DevOps engineer in part-time. And well, you have probably never heard of my name before. So let me explain how I ended up here. Well, my bachelor thesis, or part of my bachelor thesis, was the assessment of the quality of a blocklist. To be precise, the dataplane.org blocklist. And I discovered that there is some room for improvement in this blocklist. And the operator of this blocklist is John Christoph. He is also on the program committee of NANOC, or a member of the program committee. And as soon as my paper was published, he contacted me and was like, "Hi Max, I discovered that you're actually found a flaw in my data plane service." And I was like, "Yeah, I found some room for improvement." So he was like, "Okay, can I have your data? I would like to assess this myself." I was like, "Here, go ahead." I sent him a download link for the data. He was basically checking it himself. A few days later, he came back to me and told me, "Yeah, I think you got a point there. There is indeed some room for improvement." And so we stayed in contact. We assessed the data a little bit further. And at some point, he was basically saying, "Yeah, I really like the work that you've produced there. And I don't know, maybe you can consider to submit a talk to NANOC." Well, you know, I've never talked at a conference before. So I was like, "Yeah, well, let's go for NANOC. It's a decent first conference, I guess." So yeah, I submitted my talk. It was accepted, and here I am. But let's start with the actual talk. So I'll first go through the background. I think most of you should be familiar with internet scanners. For those of you who aren't, I'll quickly explain it. So an internet scanner is basically a piece of software that scans a certain IP range for hosts which are online. And as soon as it discovers a host which is online, it tries to automatically break into this host by, for instance, exploiting common username and password combinations on the SSH service running on a host. And this kind of bears a risk for intrusion. And you as network operators, you can basically mitigate the risk of such an intrusion by integrating so-called IP blocklists in your firewall. So an IP blocklist is basically a list of IP addresses where someone has identified this IP address as the origin of internet scanning. And you like when your firewall receives any request from one of those IP addresses, then you can be pretty sure it is a malicious request. So your firewall can just block it or not answer it. And as a cloudless provider, you have an interest to provide an accurate or a complete list of scanner IP addresses in your block list. And thus, you try to achieve global diversity. So you basically set up a sensor infrastructure which is globally distributed to find as many scanner IPs as possible. And the rise of cloud providers made this easy as a blocklist provider. So you can easily set up honeypots all over the world by using cloud services. And this brings me to my hypothesis. So I was asking myself I was asking myself that my hypothesis was that global diversity is insufficient to detect all scanners if your entire sensor infrastructure is purely cloud-based. So what does this actually mean? This actually means that my assumption is that some scanners do not target cloud networks. So some scanners specifically target certain hosts in certain networks. So basically, they only attack residential area networks or only attack ISP infrastructure. So this is what I want to investigate. And the goal of my work was basically to track scanners of different kinds of networks and compare the origins of the scanning activity. So are the same scanners actually targeting hosts in residential area networks as well as in cloud infrastructure, for instance? And this should ultimately answer the question if the type of the network is relevant to identify different scanners. So to sum it up, if you're a blocklist provider, where do you need to place your honeypots to find as many scanners as possible? Well, to investigate this, I was in need of an infrastructure, of a sensor infrastructure myself. So yeah, I set one up. And what I did, I set up 11 honeypots in 3 different kinds of networks. So 3 networks with different characteristics. I was operating 3 honeypots on the university campus network of the University of Twente. I was operating 4 honeypots in residential areas, specifically in the homes of some of my friends. And I was also operating 4 honeypots in cloud infrastructure to have some baseline of data to compare my findings to, or to compare the scanning activity to. And I was using 3 particular cloud service provider, DigitalOcean, Hetzner, and MyVPS. And all of these honeypots, all of these 11 honeypots were logging the data to a central database server. And the database server was just basically reading the logs from each of the honeypots and inserting it into the database. So it was parsing the log files and inserting it into the database. And to also assess the quality of the dataplane.org blocklist, as previously said, I was also in need of the data that was on the data feeds on dataplane.org. So on Dataplane or Dataplane, the data feeds on Dataplane are updated once every hour. So this was also the time frame I have used for myself. What I did, I set up a cron job, which was downloading the data feeds once every hour. And also this data was imported into the database. And then based on this resulting database, I performed my evaluation. So how did a honeypot, or what are the requirements for a honeypot in my work? In a honeypot needs to be available for 2 weeks within May 2021. So my logging period was set from the 17th to the 30th of May. And as technical requirements, it had to be Debian based. So it had to operate on, Debian, Ubuntu derivative, or Raspberry Pi OS or something like this. And this was necessary because I was familiar with the OS, and also I was in need of regular services like the OpenSSH service and the Telnet service. So these 2 were also operating on each of the honeypots. And then furthermore, I wanted to investigate VNC scanning activity as well. However, since my honeypots were running without a graphical user interface, and VNC is a graphical protocol, I kind of need an exotic implementation, and I found VNC term to be found on GitHub. And this didn't really deal well with the nightly log rotation that I've set up on the honeypot. So after a while, all of my VNC services basically crashed and didn't start again. So from now on, I can only consider SSH and Telnet data. But let's come to the results. So with these 11 honeypots and a logging period of 2 weeks, I was I was ending up with 6.6 million requests from almost 7,200 different scanners. I will investigate this in terms of SSH and Telnet data. So VNC data is not considered right now. And what did I do with the data? I tried to find geographical patterns. I also briefly investigated the importance of Tor traffic in the domain of internet scanning. Then I focused, or I tried to uncover some temporal patterns, like some global temporal phenomena, by investigating the requests based on their UTC timestamp. And then I investigated per local time zone of the originating scanner IP address. And lastly, I also investigated the coverage of those scanners that were identified by my honeypots. And the coverage of those scanners in the dataplane.org feeds. Let's start with the geographical activity of scanners. On the bottom, on the top, we see Telnet data. On the bottom, we see SSH data. On the left pie chart shows the number of scanner IP addresses identified by my honeypots, and the right one, the number of requests that have arrived at those honeypots. So a request is basically a login attempt. And for Telnet, we see that it is distributed globally. And in a sense, we can say that each country that has the different colors stand for different countries. And each country that has a developed IT infrastructure also contributes to a certain amount of Telnet scanning. And SSH shows a different picture. So SSH is purely dominated by Chinese and US-based scanners. And only Chinese and US-based scanners contribute to more than half of the number of requests arriving at my honeypots. And what's even more interesting is that the country with the third most number of scanner IPs is the Netherlands, a teeny tiny country somewhere here in Europe. And it's also interesting that it has a particularly small number of requests. So keep that in mind. We will investigate this later. But what we can say so far is Telnet is distributed equally over the globe, whereas SSH is dominated by two countries, China and the US. And if we investigate the data in detail, then we actually see that Chinese scanners mostly target the honeypots on university campuses and cloud networks. So previous research has also shown that China is somehow into intellectual property. So this might explain it. However, the US or US-based scanners target much more residential area honeypots. And then there is the Netherlands with plenty of scanner IP addresses, but very few requests in comparison. And this is what we investigate right now. So the Netherlands is not only known for its liberal drug policy, but also for its large Tor community. And what I did, I downloaded the IP addresses of the Tor exit nodes and compared it with the scanner IP addresses. And we see that quite a large number of scanning IPs are actually Tor exit nodes. However, very few requests are actually sent from those Tor exit nodes, which makes sense because routing over Tor is considerably slow. However, if we inner join the Tor exit node IP addresses from which scanning activity originates with the Dutch IP addresses of the identified scanners, then we see that quite a portion of those scanners are actually Tor exit nodes. So this explains the large number of Dutch scanner IP addresses with very few requests. Okay, let's continue with the temporal analysis. The idea was that we discover patterns in terms of the day of the week, or maybe differences between weekday scanning and weekend scanning. However, we could not really find a weekly pattern. But if we consider the hour of the day of the UTC timestamp of the request, then we see that there are slight peaks during certain hours of the day, and those are highlighted with a white background here on the right, on the graph on the right. And this brings us the idea maybe we do not need to search for global temporal phenomena, but actually local ones. So what if those peaks are related, or what if those peaks are related to the local time of the scanners? And this is what we're doing right now. So here we have depicted three example time zones for SSH and Telnet. So the time zones are of no importance, but what I want to show is the observation that we make. And as darker the background of a cell is, as more requests were performed within this hour of the day of the local time zone of the scanner. And we can clearly see that there is kind of a baseline or a base load of scanning activity, which operates all around the clock. And during certain hours of the local time, there are certain peaks. And we figured that those can be caused by scanners which are fully automated, running 24/7 for the entire year. So those contribute to the base load. And then when the bad guys are actually online and in front of their screen, then we see a peak in scanning activity, which is related to human-initiated scanning. So this is what we see from this data. And then let's continue with the coverage of the data plane feed. So basically, that part of data that brought me here, or that part of the work that brought me here, I will first investigate SSH and then Telnet data. So when considering the coverage of the SSH scanner IP addresses with the data plane feeds, then let's first consider the number of scanners that have arrived at the honeypot. So we see that 3,700 scanner IPs were attacking my honeypots in cloud and campus area networks. And in comparison, only 875 scanners have actually attacked honeypots in my residential area networks. So there is quite a difference between cloud and campus scanning and residential area network scanning. And but what we are interested in are not those scanners which target maybe cloud and campus networks. What we are interested in are scanners which target exclusively honeypots in one certain kind of network. And this is what we're doing right now. So we basically consider only those scanners which exclusively show up in the log data of honeypots in only cloud only in the cloud honeypots, or only in the campus honeypots, or only in the residential area honeypots. And we see that for cloud and campus honeypots, we see that the scanner IPs identified by these honeypots are actually covered by 90% in the dataplane.org feeds. However, for scanners that target only residential area honeypots, we see that those show up to an extent of just 29% on the dataplane feeds. So we see indeed that scanners which target certain kinds of network do not necessarily show up on the data plane or on the on blocklists from blocklist providers, which have all of their sensor infrastructure in the cloud. So let's consider the Telnet scanning activity. First of all, what we see is that the share of Telnet scanners is distributed rather equally. So around 400 scanners have arrived at each at the honeypots of each type of the network. So 400 at my cloud honeypots, 400 scanner IPs at my campus honeypots, and 400 in the residential area honeypots. And what's even more interesting is if we consider only those honeypots, only those scanners which exclusively targeted honeypots in these networks. And we see that 97% in each type of network exclusively targets honeypots in this area or in this type of network. And what's also interesting is that the coverage of those honeypots on the dataplane.org feeds ranges from 7 to 15%, which is much, much smaller in comparison to the SSH scanner IPs. And what we can conclude from this is basically maybe Telnet scanning is distributed globally much more diversely. So what we basically see is that it is harder to grasp or harder to identify Telnet scanners, since maybe those are just globally operating botnet scanners that are so distributed that it is hard to, or that one scanner never actually targets more than just one honeypot out of my 11 honeypots, for instance. The idea is that Telnet scanning is indeed, or might indeed be distributed globally much more diversely. And maybe it is related to IoT botnets like Mirai botnet or one of those derivatives. So this is what we can see from Telnet scanning. And once again, the coverage is also much smaller on the dataplane.org data. So it is indeed harder to grasp. And what we have seen so far is basically if a scanner shows up. So if one of my honeypots has identified a scanner, does it show up in the dataplane.org feeds? And if so, to what extent? And what we investigate right now is the time it takes until it shows up. So we consider the moment one of my honeypots has identified a new scanner and the number of days passed until it actually also shows up on the dataplane.org feeds. And what we see is that indeed, within the first 12 to 48 hours, the vast majority of SSH scanners also show up on the dataplane.org feeds, which is actually quite a great result. So whenever a scanner attacks a honeypot, or whenever a scanner attacks a host, it might most likely show up within the next 48 hours on the dataplane.org feeds. However, if we consider Telnet scanners, then it takes actually days. So if one of my honeypots has identified a new Telnet scanner, if it shows up, it takes days until it actually shows up on the dataplane.org feeds. So it once again confirms that Telnet scanning is much harder to identify. So yeah, those were basically the results so far of my work. And since John Christoph contacted me, we were basically updating some things and investigating some more things. And this is what I want to present right now. So first of all, in the database, we actually saw that we have some bogus IP addresses in there. So a host can never have a bogus IP address, which means a bogus IP address can never actually account for any requests. However, those bogus IP addresses in my database account for 3% of the requests. And well, we had to investigate it, and we actually discovered that some of my honeypots, or the Telnet D service on some of my honeypots, was configured such that it actually locked the reverse DNS entry instead of its IP address. And yeah, as I said, the parser for the log data was written by myself. So the regular expression was sometimes finding an IP address within this RDNS entry and was like wrongly using this as the IP address. So this accounts for approximately 5.7% of all scanner IP addresses. So this is one of the one weakness of the data set. And then further, we compared, like, after John Christoph contacted me, we actually investigated a little bit more what happens on the data plane side. And as I said, my logging period was for 2 weeks within May 2021, and he extended this time frame by 1 week earlier up to 1 week later. So we ended up with a total period or total time frame of 4 weeks. And he was basically considering the historical data of the data plane feeds for 4 weeks. And within these 4 weeks, we saw that data plane the data plane feeds have identified almost 100,000 different scanning IP addresses. And in comparison, my honeypots have, within 2 weeks, have identified 7,400 IPs. However, still not in the dataplane.org feeds were 1,900 IP addresses. And John Christoph argues, well, I have 100,000 scanner IP addresses, and you only found 2,000 which did not show up. So it's basically less than 2%. And I was saying, well, you have 300 honeypots. I have just 11, and I already discovered 1,900 not in your feed. So what would we actually have if I have 300 honeypots? However, I leave the judgment to yourself. But yeah, so this is basically the comparison to the data plane feeds. And yeah, what we can conclude is that scanners indeed target different kinds of networks, or specific scanners indeed target specific networks. And Telnet and SSH scanning is of a completely different nature. So Telnet seems to be much more distributed. But the most important message that I want to communicate with you today is that if you're a blocklist provider and you want to identify as many scanners as possible, then do not only consider global diversity, but also consider a qualitative diversity of networks where you need to place your honeypots. Well, with this slide, I want to thank you. I want to specifically thank John Christoph for supporting me and for inviting me to submit my talk to NANOC, and also for providing some insights to the dataplane.org infrastructure. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask and or to contact me. Thank you very much.
Oh, we got one online here from Gus. How much did you invest, time and money?
Well, money was actually considerably cheap, because it was a bet, or like this work was basically the result of my bachelor project. And regarding the honeypots running on the university campus and in residential area networks, those were basically just running Raspberry Pis or services of my friends, which were online anyway. So I wasn't paying for this. Regarding the 4 cloud honeypots, I was setting up one myself on the Hetzner cloud, which was just, I think, for the entire time of 2 weeks online, was it around €2. And the other ones were actually sponsored by the university. And one was sponsored by my friend, by a friend of mine. And yeah, in terms of money, it was for myself just €2 in total. I guess something like €20 for the 2 weeks of logging data, of logging time. And in terms of time, this entire project was going on for 10 weeks. And setting everything up was quite some work, because it was hard to actually find all of the people who can operate a honeypot for me. Especially if you want to convince someone, do you want to host a vulnerable service within your home network for me for some research? So this took actually some time, and then the data evaluation was something like 4 to 5 weeks in total in continuous exchange with my supervisor. So as I said, in total, including writing the paper, it was 10 weeks work.
Excellent. We have a question from the audience. Go ahead, sir.
Daryl Budick, SBA Edge. Max, I was wondering if you did any further correlation of the sources in relation to your targets. Did you see if some were coming from residentials, clouds, various specific cloud providers or universities?
No, I did not investigate this. So the focus of my work was basically comparing the scanners which arrive at residential area honeypots, cloud honeypots, and campus area honeypots, but I did not investigate where the scanners are coming from.
Possibly another interesting angle to look at. Thank you.
Absolutely agree with you.
We have another question online. It's from Jeff with a G. You infer that the scanner is aware of type of address, campus, residential, etc. Have you compared the data against the broad range of honeypots that allow a larger address range that is untyped? Are the scanners the same?
No, I also didn't investigate this. So there are still a couple of things that I would like to investigate as soon as I have some time. So the data is still available, and if you want, just contact me. I can provide to you a download link. So what I actually did is I was only considering the type of network, basically. I also compared some honeypots or the scanning activity of honeypots within a certain type of network, and those also gave some insights. But yeah, those results are all in the paper. So maybe just search for the paper "Should network operators up on the data plane?" Then you find some more insights. But sorry that I couldn't give actually a more precise answer to your question. I hope this anyway answers it somehow.
Excellent. We have 28 seconds and one last person in the audience.
Hi, Zach Uza with Code 42. Did you consider the possibility that during your collection period, the data feed blocklist may have been actively used by your upstream providers, and how that might skew the data?
What exactly do you mean they might be used by my upstream providers? Well, you wouldn't be able
to detect potential sources of the scanning if the blacklist were in use actively. Just wondering how that...
okay. So you mean if an ISP, for instance, just blocks incoming data from the blocklist? I actually did not consider this. That's a pretty good point. But personally, I wouldn't necessarily expect it, because first of all, the cloud honeypots that I was using, it wouldn't make sense, in my opinion, to actually block any incoming requests. Specifically, if you want to set up a service which is kind of used for such research. And yeah, regarding, I mean, university campus networks are usually rather liberal, so I don't think that there is any blocking happening. And yeah, regarding the home networks, I can't really argue. I'm not so sure how liberal the Dutch ISPs are.
Sure. Thank you.
Excellent.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Max. I appreciate it. And if we can get a round of applause for Max. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And also John Christoph for encouraging him to do it too. Thank you, John.